We don't always know where our first impressions come from. And we definitely don't know what they truly mean over time. And therefore, there's something for us to understand and appreciate about the fragility of a first impression. Go back with me almost, 28 years ago, 29 years ago, and I was a freshman in college, and I'm at freshman orientation, and if you've ever gone to college or high school, and there's that orientation time, and they want you to learn the fight song, and they want you to learn the mascot, all the traditions, they want you to learn all these things, and then usually they bring in somebody who's going to encourage you and challenge you, some guest speaker, and our guest speaker got up, and he was full of energy, and he was getting the crowd laughing, and he happened to be a pastor in our city in Dallas, and I just remember sitting back while the crowd, all these freshmen and their parents are just like, yay, and this guy's funny, and I remember sitting back thinking, this guy's a dork. And he's just super annoying, and he laughs at his own jokes before anybody else can laugh. And so I'm feeling sorry for this guy, but the room erupts with all this emotion, and he does what he's supposed to do as a guest speaker. He gets people excited. A couple years later, I find myself visiting his church. He's not the main pastor, but he's one of the pastors there, and my journey to faith kind of led through that church, and I ended up giving my life to Christ through a crazy experience for another time, and ended up seeing the guy in a different light. Okay, he's not too bad. And after I gave my life to Christ, and I'm walking through growing as a young Christian, as a 20-year-old, I have a conversation with my mother, who was with me at the freshman orientation. And she goes, remember that freshman orientation a few years ago? I was like, yeah. She goes, do you remember who spoke at the freshman orientation? And I was like, I didn't really remember. She goes, yeah, it was the guy who's mentoring you now. I was like, Scott was the speaker. You know, the guy that you hated? The guy you thought was a dork and annoying, and I said, yeah. She goes, I could tell on your face this guy was bothering you like crazy. And in that moment, I prayed to God, God, let this be the pastor who leads my son to a growing relationship with you. I said, you are so lying right now. She goes, no. Because I knew it would take somebody so different than you, someone who got under your skin to help you grow. I had no intentions of being a Christ follower. I was raised in the church. I didn't want a relationship with God, but as I grew, God used this person, and I got to be honest with you, I had to ask myself a question in that moment. Yeah, am I really going to let this guy help me grow? And I had to answer the questions and really look at my first impression. Why? Because my first impression judged him. My first impression put me over him because he's just so annoying. Now, I look back and I wish I could say all those things really weren't true. No, he really was annoying, and he was dorky, and he was really loud, right? But I see it through a different lens now. Why? Because I see it through a lens of relationship. I see it through a lens of somebody who came alongside me as a mentor, and I have to allow my pride and how I saw this person or judged this person, I have to let that subside a little bit. And I got to let you know that we all do this. We all have that first impression, that judgy thing we do. It happened this last week. I was driving down the road, and I saw this car that had just like 50 bumper stickers all over it. And I couldn't even read them. I was like, who does that to their car? And I don't know this person, right? And then on the same trip, I pull up in our church parking lot, and our youth pastor has bumper stickers on his car. And I was like, oh, it's okay. I love Isaiah. But 10 minutes earlier, I was judging the person down the street from my house. See, we all do this. And the dynamic of relationship and the dynamic of pride all comes to play when it comes to growing in humility. And you got to know, one of the primary reasons relationships and ventures break down is because of our pride. It's because of our pride. You know pride. It's okay to elbow your husband or wife next to you. You know pride. I'm saying it for you. Yes, you know pride. It's what happens when we're arrogant, when we're closed off to feedback or input, and we think ourselves better than those around us. Well, I don't do that. Yes, you do. Yes, you do. Even in trying to be altruistic and be good in the world, we still do this. You see it all the time. You see somebody who is feeding the homeless. You see somebody who is helping their neighbor during a winter storm. You see somebody who is helping children in after-school programs. You see somebody who is going on a mission trip. You see somebody doing good, and because they don't see other people doing it, what do? The tone changes. It's like, well, if you're not doing what I'm doing, then what are you good for? So even in doing good, we can elevate our pride. So there's a couple images I want us to look at, and there's one of an overinflated ego. And then the one after that is the underinflated ego. And when you see this, yes, it's like a cartoon as you look at it, but it's not a cartoon because it has real life implications. How we see ourselves and how we go about seeing others and interacting in the world around us has real life implications. I don't know if you saw this last week, a heartbreaking story of a young lady who was working through some emotional issues and mental health issues, and somehow, with all of her issues, she wanted to take her life. So sad. But the sad part was she also convinced her parents to do the same thing. So the three of them took their life because one person that they loved and cared for couldn't handle this life and convinced her mom and dad to do the same. See, how we feel about ourselves, whether overinflated or underinflated, all still has to do with ego and pride. That is something we have to understand, that in both cases, we're still thinking of ourselves too much. What does God have to say about this? And what God has to say about it is something we try to really live out here at Gateway. Before we get into Scripture, and it's something that I love that we say, and our pastors, as we talk with people and love people, when it says, humility is confidence in who God is and who God says I am. No more, no less. Well, I'm just trying to be meek and I live below. That's your ego and pride causing you to live low. Well, I'm better than what people think I am. That's your ego and your pride saying you're more. And humility is this tension point where you are exactly and living exactly what God has asked you to live, no more, which we assume around pride or ego, and also no less. So we are in this study of Daniel. We're in chapter 4. And there's some really cool things happening. We'll do a rundown here in a little bit. We're going to go right to chapter 4, and we're going to start in verse 1. And this is a hard chapter, not because it's hard to teach or understand, but the issues that are at play in chapter 4. And again, I encourage you and challenge you, read along with us every single week. Just go back and read the chapter. So here we go, verse 1. King Nebuchadnezzar, who's the king of the Babylonians, who's building this empire, who's taken slaves and people back into Babylon, to the nations and people of every language who live in all the earth, may you prosper greatly. It is my pleasure to tell you about the miraculous signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed for me. Now, this book is written from Daniel's perspective, but somehow in chapter 4, Daniel allows the narrator of chapter 4 to actually be his oppressor, King Nebuchadnezzar. King Nebuchadnezzar is given voice in this, and here he is praising God and giving God glory. When we've just read in the first 3 chapters, he's taking glory for himself. How did he get to this part? How is he getting to the point where he's worshiping a God that is not his own? And it's not part of his culture. And what does it say about humility? Here's what we know. Worship is a sign of humility. Worship says, in light of the thing I'm worshiping, is less. And so when we worship God, and I know it can be hard for some of us, especially if you're exploring who God is and you come in this room and you see Paul jumping around, he's doing his thing, he's all over stage, and that guy's really weird, it must be a Korean thing. It's not Korean. You know what it is? It's worship. And I'm glad that we have a worship leader who's willing to make a fool of himself, because he has a pastor who makes a fool of himself all the time, as an act of worship to God. We don't make fools of ourselves just to do that, even though I do that as well, and so do you. No, and when it comes to God, we worship. So some people raise their hands. Some people sing really loud, even if they can't sing, because they don't care. It's not about them. Well, that person's ruining my worship experience. Really? They probably are, because if it's ruining your worship experience, they should ruin it, because that experience has become about you. And worship is about God. Worship about a humility of saying, I'm singing words that I am still trying to live. I'm singing words that maybe I don't understand, but it's about a God that I'm not really fully going to understand in my entire lifetime until I see him face to face. See, worship is a sign of humility. So why is this king of the Babylonians, why is this heathen, this person who does not know the God of all gods, why is he worshiping him? Chapter 4 begins the journey. And it's a journey of humility, because humility is confidence in who God is first. So he finds himself on this journey of understanding who God is, and Nebuchadnezzar discovers confidence in God the hard way. Now, if you're watching online, I want you to participate. If you're in the room, I want you to participate. Okay, no passive people on this one. How many of you could at least, not your partner, not your kids, not your parents if you're sitting next to them, you yourself say, if I'm being honest, I am a person who has to learn things the hard way. Just raise your hand if you're that person. Yeah, that's about half of us, if not most of us, right? I am one of those people. I have to learn the hard way. And we see this in Nebuchadnezzar. If we pick up in chapter 4, verse 9, it says this, I said, this is, King Nebuchadnezzar, Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in you, and no mystery is too difficult for you. Here is my dream. Interpret it for me. These are the visions I saw while lying in bed. This king has a lot of dreams. But it's God interrupting his space. See, when he's awake, he's running a kingdom. When he's asleep, it's his most vulnerable place, and God is invading his sleep and doesn't even know it. He goes, I looked, and there before me stood a tree in the middle of the land, and its height was enormous. The tree grew large and strong, and its top touched the sky. It was visible to the ends of the earth. Its leaves were beautiful, its fruit abundant, and on it was food for all. Under it, the wild animals found shelter, and the birds lived in the branches, and from it every creature was fed. Verse 13, in the visions I saw while lying in bed, I looked, and there before me was a holy one, a messenger coming down from heaven. And he called in a loud voice, cut down the tree and trim off its branches. He must have been part of the winter storm here in Austin this last week. Strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the animals flee from under it and the birds from its branches. But let the stump and its roots bound with iron and bronze remain in the ground, in the grass of the field. And let him be drenched with the dew of heaven. And let him live with the animals among the plants of the earth. And let his mind be changed from that of a man. And let him be given the mind of an animal. This is weird, right? But it's all in a dream. Until 7 times pass before him. And that means 7 years, right? So one time would be a full calendar year. 7 years like this. The decision is announced by messengers. The holy ones declare the verdict so that the living may know that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and give them to anyone he wishes and sets over them the lowliest of people. And this is the dream that I, King Nebuchadnezzar, had. Now, Belteshazzar, which is also Daniel, that's his other name, that's his slave name. His name is Daniel. Tell me what it means, for none of the wise men in my kingdom can interpret it for me, but you can, because the spirit of the holy gods is in you. Now, there's a lot happening in this dream. There's trees and there's shelter and there's food for everyone and the animals, and everything looks really good because everything is based on this tree. And in the dream, the tree is the king. He's built this kingdom. He's got all this money. He's got all these employees. He's got everything he could have, and everybody is somewhat happy because, yeah, they're slaves, but they have food to eat, and there's safety, and there's peace, and the animals love it. And so Daniel comes and interprets the dream, verse 25. He has to walk in humility. He was asked this. It's like when somebody asks you, hey, just tell me the truth. And you're like, oh, man, don't do this to me. Don't do this to me. And some of you are such truth tellers even when somebody doesn't even ask you. Then they give you permission. You're like, oh. And this is what Daniel has to do. Verse 25, he says this, you, the king, you will be driven away from people, and you will live with the wild animals, and you will eat grass like the ox and be drenched with the dew of heaven. And 7 times or 7 years will pass by for you until you acknowledge the Most High is sovereign over all the kingdoms of earth and gives them to anyone he wishes. And the command to leave the stump of the tree with its roots means that your kingdom will be restored to you when you acknowledge that heaven rules. Verse 27, and therefore, your majesty, be pleased to accept my advice. Renounce your sins by doing what is right, and your wickedness will be kind to the and your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed. It may be that then your prosperity will continue. You're talking to a king who has everything. And he's telling the king, you're going to lose it all because of your pride, because it's about you. It's about your kingdom. It's about your opinions, and you're always right. Let me tell you something, sir. You're not always right. Let me tell you something, ma'am. You're not always right or wrong. There's a humility in understanding that sometimes you're right and sometimes you're wrong. You know, when I make a mistake in my house, my kids think it's the funniest thing. Why? Because I have pride issues. I have to work through pride issues. And so when I make a mistake, oh my gosh, when I make a mistake on stage here, everybody just thinks it's hilarious. I mean, no joke, I'm telling you a little secret. You know how many times I check my zipper before coming on stage every weekend? 5. When I walk down the hallway, when I'm getting behind the curtain, when I'm on my way out, and during the bumper video, I'll turn around and check it, and I'm telling you all my secrets. Why? Because I don't want to be humiliated. Because if I walked out here one weekend with my zipper down, first of all, my family would never let me forget it. My staff would never let me forget it. And you jokers would never let me forget it either. Right? It's the truth. But Daniel wasn't relishing this moment. He wasn't saying, ha ha, God got you. You're down for the count. He just humbly warned him. And look how Nebuchadnezzar responds, right? He's getting the stern warning. He already knows God's real, but it's Daniel's God. It's the Hebrew boy's God. It's not his God. And look what he does. verse 4, verse 29, and 30, and then we're going to skip to 33 so we can get to the point. 12 months later, after the dream, as the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, he said, "Is not this the great Babylon that I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty?" Hasn't he been warned over and over again? And yet he forgets a year later, and verse 33, immediately what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from people and ate grass like the ox. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle and his nails like the claws of a bird. Most theologians believe in that moment, it's what we talk about in the New Testament, he was given over to a reprobate mind. He lost his mind. It wasn't just a mental health issue that was growing over time, that there was this pride thing that took over, and he gave himself over and lost the ability to interact with people, and he lived amongst the animals. Here's the truth. If we don't learn humility, we might just face humiliation. Do you know we get to choose the paths we take? And if we don't learn humility, we might face humiliation. And here's the key. We can hear the story, and as we go through it, oh, that king, and look what happened in Daniel. But we learn things in Scripture because as we learn those, we learn about our own interaction with God. Because if we're not careful, we'll end up consuming his story instead of considering his story. It's like all the fables you read your children. Aesop's fables. I remember them when I was a kid, but they were for real life lessons. So as we dive into chapter 4, you got to understand this isn't a story that happened thousands of years ago. This is a story that has real life implications for you and me today. So do you realize that God isn't just the giver of visions and dreams, but that God is the vision? God is the dream. He so wants you and I, that we were made for relationship with him, that sometimes if we're not careful, we'll take this love, we'll take all this energy, we'll take all these things from the recesses of our soul, and we will give it away to everything else. And God's like, I gave you that for you and I. I mean, can you imagine, sir, you give your wife the gift of a couple's massage. You're going to go together. If you find out a few weeks later that she had in mind taking her best friend with her and not you. Some of you are like, I'm totally cool with that. I don't want a massage. Or you give the gift of a trip to your husband or to your partner or to your parents, and you know that you're going to be part of that, and they take it with their best friend or they go with someone else. I always feel bad for those people who win something on television and it's a free trip or it's a free concert or it's a free vacation. Who are you going to take with you? And they have family around them like, oh, well, who else are you going to say? You see, that's what we do with God. We have these gifts and this love and this joy and this soul with that has deep roots to it. And what do we do with all of that energy? We give it somewhere. And I wonder if we knew that we're giving all of that as a way to give it back to God, who is the vision, who is the dream. And where we see Nebuchadnezzar stumble in his pride, we see the opposite in Daniel, who is a great example for us of humility. See, he has confidence in who God is, but not only that, he also has confidence in who God says he is, because humility is also confidence in who God says you are. Not just who God is. He takes that and he puts that in us, this identity of who we are. And so it allows us to step into places and step into situations to be confident that he is with us. That he who began the good work in you and I will be with us to its completion, whatever completion looks like. So we have these situations that we learned in the first few weeks that Daniel in chapter 1, verse 12 and 13, he's put in this position. He says, please test your servant for 10 days and give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. And then compare us with those young men who ate the royal food. He tested it because there's a confidence that God was with him. And then chapter 2, verse 24, then Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to execute the wise men of Babylon. And he said to him, do not execute the wise men of Babylon and take me to the king. I will interpret his dream for him. Do you have that kind of confidence that God is with you? That God is for you? That God has called you? Because we could have confidence in who God is, but part of humility is allowing that confidence to also be who God has called us to be. And that humility takes place because every time Daniel gets put in these situations, you hear this phrase, and then Daniel prayed, right? He gets on his knees. And this journey of humility of who God is and who God expects us to be is a journey that it happens on our knees in prayer. It's this humble sign of God. It's not about me, it's about you. And you got to remember, in these days, people didn't always have carpets. They had cobblestone streets, and they slept basically on concrete or dirt. And yet they humbled themselves in prayer, and you know this phrase, and they bowed their knee because there was a physical sign of humility. I know for many of us, we don't do that. I mean, I don't know about you. I see the royals, and they bow to the king or the queen. I'm like, we're Americans. We don't do that. We don't bow to anybody. But the best sign we do of humility is we shake our hand, right? But there's a blind spot to that. How do we position ourselves in a humble way? And Daniel somehow in his humility found a way to humble himself before God, not shouting at God, but going before him with a humble bowed knee because he knew who God was. And he knew what God was calling him to do. And I wonder, the question for us, do you know your calling and your Creator? And to fully explore what that means, to fully explore this confidence in who Jesus says he is and who God says he is on our behalf. Because again, humility is confidence in who God is and who God says I am. No more, no less. And for some of us who struggle with being more than we should be, no more. And for some of us who say, well, I'm just going to humble myself and be less, it's no less. And then here we find ourselves. The king is living out for 7 years with the animals. But his sanity returns and his kingdom is restored because he acknowledges the God of all gods. Verse 34. At the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes towards heaven and my sanity was restored. What did he do first? He raised his eyes towards heaven. And his sanity was restored. And then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. His dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth, and no one can hold back his hand or say to him, what have you done? Verse 36, at the same time that my sanity was restored, my honor and splendor returned to me for the glory of my kingdom, and my advisors and nobles sought me out, and I was restored to my throne and became even greater than before. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right, and all his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble. Look at that 7-year journey. That 7-year journey of loss, of losing his mind, of not able to interact with people, living like an animal, hair grown out, nails grown out, literally living like an animal. That's how deep his pride was. It wasn't that he had to go 7 years, it's that God knew the depths of his pride was going to take 7 years. And look at us. We don't have to go through years of wandering, friends. We don't have to go through years of feeling like we've lost our mind. No. All it takes is a moment where we say, I'm not going to live like that anymore. I'm not going to live above an inflated version of myself, and I'm not going to live a deflated version of myself. And it might disrupt relationships, and it might disrupt some things, because you know what? We teach people how to treat us. Do you know that? You teach people how to treat you. And then some people walk on eggshells around you because you have an overinflated sense of being, and other people railroad you because you have an understated sense of being, and that neither one of those is okay. It's this humility to be everything that God is in us and trusting that. And we see it played out over and over again in real life, just like we do in Daniel. We see it played out over and over again. We see it in the lives of Martin Luther King Jr., of Rosa Parks, this month that we're celebrating black leaders and people who made a difference for our black brothers and sisters. It's like, man, they lived it with humility. There's something about humility that sticks to you. There's something about that person that opens the door for you, that person who looks you in the eye, that person who talks to you when nobody's talked to you, that person who takes you in when everybody else is rejecting you, because their voice, their presence brings something. One of our pastors wrote this for us. I'm just going to quote it, so I'm going to read it. When it comes to humility, do they look down on others? No. With boldness, they interpret the dreams of sometimes furious and fickle Babylonian kings without flinching a muscle. With creative vision, they give voice to a dream for a better and more just tomorrow. See, people with humility, with clear conviction, they take up spaces as a respectful but clear act of defiance, not against humanity, but against the forces that would seek to rob us of our collective humanity. They don't play to the crowds. They don't try to be big enough for the crowds, and they don't let the crowds run over them. In humility, they did everything that they are, and instead they truly live before an audience of one God. Nothing else matters, no one else matters, and because they're not tied to the fickle opinions of others, they're free. Free to love, free to risk, free to love everyone life by life, free to follow God towards the things and people that matter to Him. Can that be said of you, brothers and sisters? Can that be said of you, that humility, that you exude this humility, this confidence in who God is and who God says that you are, no more, no less, not living for the crowds, not living to make everybody else happy, but truly confident in who we is? Can we live this out together? Can we truly live that out together? As you walked in, you were given the elements for communion today. We're going to do a little bit different today. Really quick, if you've never done this before, we have an open table here at Gateway Church where if you believe in Jesus and you've acknowledged Jesus as part of your life, we invite you to participate. If you're exploring God, you're not quite there yet, we ask you to abstain, but you don't have to give this back. You can hold on to it. You can turn back in if you want to. We ask you not to participate. This is for those who would say, I believe in who Jesus is. Because if anybody exemplified this humility, it was Jesus, who modeled this for us. Fully God, fully man. Didn't try to be an earthly king the way that people wanted him to. He wasn't trying to be an earthly warrior to overthrow the Romans the way that people wanted him to. No, that was more than what he was supposed to do. And yet he wasn't just another voice. He wasn't just another prophet. He was the Son of God. He wrestled with this tension of not being more and not being less. And yet in that, he was humbled and humiliated that he gave his life on a cross for you and I. And this bread represents his body that was broken for us. And the juice represents his blood that was shed for us. His life of humility causes us to live in a joy and in his suffering. And I know it sounds paradoxical to joy in his suffering, but he did that to model for us that there can be joy in your suffering. And that there's hope beyond this. So as the band comes and sings out during this time of communion, I want you to just let them sing it over you, but whenever you're ready, you open up, you take the bread and remember the body of Christ. And when you're ready, you drink the other side, the juice, you remember his blood that was shed for you so that you could walk in true freedom and walk in humility. Nothing more than that and nothing less. Let's take the elements together.